We're back on films now, and we're delighted to introduce John Furse. Hi, John.
Hi. Hello.
John directed the film Blind Flight, which recreates the harrowing time that Brian Keenan and John McCarthy endured when they were abducted in Beirut. Ros, do you want to just remind everyone who Brian Keenan and John McCarthy were?
Well, Brian Keenan was from Northern Ireland, Belfast. He was a teacher, a university lecturer, and he went out to Beirut and was taken hostage. John McCarthy was a journalist, wasn't he? Yeah. Again, he also went out. They both were taken hostage at the same time and were locked away together for many, many years. And it's a harrowing story. I've seen the film, so I can comment on it as well. It's gripping, totally gripping.
John, what attracted you to this story? I mean, it's obviously it's a gripping narrative, and if I remember, it gripped the whole nation.
Yeah, it was a huge story, but of course, it was an accident. Actually, I'd worked with a very well-known British documentary director called Mike Grigsby, and he took me over to Galway, to Shannon, to meet Brian. Who was less than 6 months out of captivity, and I hadn't seen Brian's legendary speech on television on his return that moved everybody and sort of sparked the whole story in the public mind. So I met Brian for the first time in Shannon. He had a little red setter with him. Which shat everywhere. I mean, it was extraordinary. And but in the car, when I met him, and we sat in the cafe, the key thing that actually happened was when I said to him, I wouldn't do anything that was in any way, prejudicial about Arabs, Muslims, and so on. Midnight expressive, if you like, is how I put it. And he said, I'm really glad you said that, because John and I spoke often, weeks, days, months, talking about the possible film of our story. And that's the one thing we agreed on. So that was a very important bridge, actually. And I said, well, why don't we just fly blind together and see what happens? And literally 2 weeks later, I was out in Westport with Brian in complete isolation in this bungalow in the lee of Crowpatrick, 7 miles away from Westport. We had no television, no newspapers, absolutely nothing. Just the two of us there, actually, in this beautiful setting, and we immediately hit it off. And he got me a typewriter, an old ball, what's it called, typewriter. Yeah. And he paced around the room, and I asked questions all the time, and I put together a 75-page outline, far longer than a normal outline. It's normally 25 pages, but there's such extraordinary material from Northern Ireland from the time before he went to Beirut. That's extraordinary. None of that's really in the film. That's a story in itself. Because one of the big things that really attracted me in the story, as he told it, it very quickly became apparent to me that it was kind of a biblical story. It really was. An extraordinary story, not just about two guys, the extraordinary growth they went through as individuals through their relationship, but it was also about crossing divides. You had Brian, who was a Protestant, who became sympathetic with the other side. So that was one bridge cross. You had the public school boy who could easily have been the other side of a machine gun in the British Army, with Brown, a Republican. And then you had the bridge between the two guys and the guards. So it's such an extraordinary, profound story about the ability of people to transcend where they come from.
Did Keenan and McCarthy know each other before they were shackled up together?
No, the irony of the whole thing was that Brian had been kidnapped. He'd gone away. He'd gone to Lebanon to get away from the troubles. Things were not easy for people like him. He was kidnapped, and John was sent out by, I think it was CNN, to try to do a story about him. And John was kidnapped as he was leaving Lebanon, obviously having not been able to see Brian. Then they were finally put together in a cell together. And the interesting thing, as I learned, was that Brown was such a handful. I mean, I always say to people that if you want to know Northern Ireland, there's nobody who personifies Northern Ireland better than Brian. He's an extraordinary individual, and obviously at that time very explosive, because he kept on showing his Irish passport and saying, "You can't take me. It's a neutral country." And it had no effect. So he was not somebody to take it lying down, put it that way. And I think he was such a handful for the guards that they decided to put him in with this Englishman who was the epitome of the English public school boy, who was always looking for consensus and defusing conflict. Where does your story start? Are they already in captivity, or do we see them before the saga? No, in the screenplay, there was 3 or 4 scenes of Brian in the before he goes to Ireland, but that actually was cut out in the edit, and you go straight to him leaving his villa in Lebanon and being kidnapped. The two of them, they were together for something like 4 years. What kind of relationship developed between the two men? Yeah, they were together 4.5 years. Well, I always characterise it as a kind of as a sort of spiritual love story. There was an extraordinary bond that developed between them, which was based on them having to reveal themselves in ways that men don't normally reveal themselves, and that's what I found extremely interesting. I can't really say more than that. I mean, that's the heart of the film, really. Yeah. Well, perhaps we should play the trailer very quickly. There still are tickets available. It's on the 20th of October.
No move! No move! Get in!
You must be Brian Keenan. I'm John McCarthy. How'd you do? I want to see the sun.
This is your son. If we're attacked, everybody goes boom.
You afraid?
I'm long since past that. I just don't want it to happen in the dark.
They must have released a couple.
Hope for everything, John. Expect nothing.
John is a good boy. He hasn't done anything wrong. I ask whoever is holding him, they do not harm our son.
Stop it! In the name of God, stop it!
I want to kill him, John.
You stand up straight, you stick that chin out, and you pretend they're not there.
I'm not afraid of you or your toy.
I'm really sorry, mate. I'm losing you.
You must not let all of this take over you, John. You have to show them that you still have a free mind.
Our prisoner here also can't go nowhere, can't do nothing.
We gotta get out of this place. If it's the last thing we ever do. What part of themselves do they see locked up in me? And how much of me is locked up in them?
Sounds quite action-packed there. Tell us how you promised Brian and John that you'd be fair on their captors. How's their relationship with their captors developed during the course of the movie? It's difficult. It's a difficult one. It takes time because the leader of the captors is quite psychotic. Brown described it very well, where he says how much of them is in me and me is in them, which for me was an absolute key line, a key perception of his. The other guards, what I learnt from them was that they were just being paid, I think, $10 a month. They were doing it for their families. They were kind of innocent boys, really. But they were under this extremely psychotic guard, and they were very They were very intrigued by these Westerners' sexuality. It's not in the film, but Saeed, the psychopath,
I think it is this bit is in the film where he says, in America, all men fuck men in bushes and things, and also it refers to men's cocks as stomach fingers. Terribly intrigued, and you see it in the film. He squeezes Brian when Brian is rebelling. It's an almost sexual thing that he's feeling this Westerner out. And Brian said, that there's the sort of sense of sexual repression in these young guys is very potent.
What day do you want?
A lot of the film obviously is the two of them, Brian and John, developing their relationship, having those hopes dashed. How did you treat the relationship between the two principals?
It's difficult to say. Quite naturally. I mean, the thing is that they were so open with me. I could ask them anything. And I always felt when I was the screenplay was the key to it. First, getting the story together, and what in the film business we call a treatment. That life doesn't happen in 3 acts. So my job was to find, and you don't do it consciously, you do it intuitively, but to find the shape and the form of the story. And I would say to Brian, we need something here, and he'd immediately come up. And I said the same thing happened with John. John joined on the second draft of the script. The first draft of the script is 272 pages, and eventually got it down to about 105 pages was the shooting script. But they both always had answers to questions. And it's difficult to say, because you haven't seen the film, it's difficult to say how I do it. You just do it, the characters take you over. And I have to say one thing, sitting over there and listening to the music was so nostalgic for me, because so much of the film was basically inspired by this Irish soul, if you like. When I first went over to Ireland to meet Brian, it was an entirely intuitive action. I took 2 particular albums with me to Ireland. One was Bob Dylan's "Oh Mercy," and that had there was the man in the long black coat. It doesn't feature in the film, but it had resonance for Brian and the death of his father and this strange character in black that he sensed when he was carrying his father's coffin, of this guy watching him. This is all stuff in the treatment that never got into the fine screenplay. But the other absolutely key track, the most key track of all, which as I said, I took completely intuitively, was Van Morrison's Poetic Champions Compose. And I played, because I realised they haven't heard any music for 4.5 years, and I played Motherless Child to him, and it was just wonderful, looking out over Clew Bay from this bungalow, just 100 yards from the sea. And every morning I played it. And the weird thing is that quite soon into writing the treatment, Brian told me about it was known as the Beirut Hilton. That's what the prisoners called it. It was a horrendous underground prison that had been built somewhere around Beirut, which was entirely encased in white ceramic tiles and just had little flickering pale blue neon strips. It was horrendous. In fact, Brian and John christened it the House of Fun, which obviously was extremely ironical. But the image, he described them being dropped into the ground. We have a ladder in the film. But I thought it was these two guys had to go back to their childhood to discover the men they truly were. That was the sort of approach. And it was like being dropped into the mother's belly. And so it was completely coincidental that the song and the symbol and what actually happened actually worked together.
To go to your home school.
Was it easy to cast the 2 principals?
What actually happened, it was quite strange, because it was such a huge number 1 story, and I was a nobody really. I'd worked with, done quite so, but I was a nobody in terms of making movies, and suddenly I had the rights to the story, and Channel 4 leapt at it, and they wanted a world-class director and star names and all that. And I've got a wonderful file full of rejection letters from Louis Malle, Peter Weir, John Borman. Nick Rogue didn't send a rejection. I mean, I met Nick Rogue, and he said, "Look, I've read 2,000 screenplays, probably my life, but only once before have I read a screenplay where I knew whoever wrote it should direct it. I'll help you in whatever way I can." But I couldn't do anything about it because, it was supposed to be a big thing. So I ran out of directors. The film was completely, I thought it's never going to happen. A lighting cameraman, a friend of mine, John de Boorman, who did the full Monty, said, "Well, why don't you direct it? I've helped first-time directors. That's, and then my key advisors said, well, if that actors trust anybody, it's the person who wrote the script." So I took the script round, and then Nick Rogue had recommended Celestia Fox, who'd cast Nick Rogue, Bertolucci, all those people, film. And she got Joe Fiennes, who was hot off Shakespeare in Love. He leapt at it. And Robert Carlyle, who was hot off Trainspotting. So I immediately had two really bankable stars. The problem that then Brown and John, once I got the package together, I needed a producer, and Sally Hibbin, who was one of Ken Loach's producers, and fantastically good at getting difficult films because it's first-time director. That particular moment was when the whole middle ground of filmmaking was collapsing, and she was an expert at getting low-budget films together. So it ended up with me directing it. Joe Fiennes stayed with it for a time, but dropped out after 2 years. And Ian Hart had been recommended by Celestia. Then Joe had to drop out, and Celestia recommended Linus. And it was perfect. It was a perfect combination, actually. It was yin and yang. Perfect.
That's Linus Roach.
Yes.
Stephen, you've seen the film.
It's marvellous. It's an exceptional piece of filmmaking, and I have to congratulate John on making it. I didn't know of it before. I think I might have seen this once a long time ago. It's not a film, it should be said, that you're likely to go back for repeated viewings, because it's very, very disturbing. But I found it both heart-rending and heartwarming overall. The story is one of triumph in the end, which the Keenan McCarthy story is one of eventual triumph. But it's a long journey to get there. What I'm interested that John says that it's got a spiritual element to it. I don't know, might be just because I'm Irish, but it was reminded me of Beckett. It reminded me of Waiting for Godot, where you have these two guys who are stuck together in a kind of strange netherworld, and they never know when they're going to get out of it. The suspension of their understanding of time, the way they have to kind of redevelop almost their thinking processes outside of time. In fact, there's one element in it when they are, after several years, it seems, they're given watches, and that's the first time that they actually know what the time is in the story. It is a film where you're almost entirely stuck in one room most of the time, and there's not a great deal of action in it, yet developing the psychology of the characters is very, very well done. How did you go about kind of working on the plot structure and the emotional development of the character arcs?
One of the problems of getting a named director was people, they couldn't see how to do two men in a room. They found it really difficult. The only person who bit was Polanski, and I had some really interesting meetings with Polanski, but he'd got a 2-picture contract with a big French company, and that expired, so he couldn't. He'd already got another thing to go on to, and he wasn't worried about doing two men in a room.
We were talking about Blind Flight. We're here with John Furse, the director. It's on at the ICC on the 20th of October. After the movie, there's a Q&A with you and Brian and John. how are they now? I mean, it was around 20 years ago, wasn't it? So,
well, they're still very, very close friends, of course.
Have they recovered from?
Yes, they have. They have, and they've all got families and kids and all that. The thing is, what's quite special about it for me is it's the first time I will have seen the film together with both of them. And in fact, I think it's both the first time they've both seen the film together. And I never really spoke to Brian about the film. I think he saw it at the Dublin Film Festival, Irish Film Festival. So it's, and also Brian's bringing his two sons who are in their early mid-20s. They've never seen the film.
Wow.
So it's going to be a pretty special night.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, we're looking forward to that.
And also, I recommend any cinema that's listening in to pick up on giving it a screening. It does deserve to be redistributed, to get distribution, because it's so current, it's so important now, and it's a brilliant film.
It's a lost film, if you don't mind me saying. So it's a lost film. One of the things I thought I'd failed because the film just disappeared. It got great reviews, got nominations and a prize for Best Actor award from Scorsese and De Niro at the Tribeca Festival, and then it just disappeared. And I couldn't find it anywhere. It wasn't on any of the streamers. And then when I put out on Facebook that I was screening it in January, the original sales guy for it contacted me, and he said we'd like it back, and he had to do some research, and it turned out that nobody got the rights. It's a real classic sort of lost film, if you like.
Well, there's a chance to see it right here at the ICC on the 20th of October. Thank you very much, John, for coming in and sharing your experiences with Brian and John. And thank you, Steve, for stepping in and giving us a very short review.